The Waitress. They underestimated. It was supposed to be just another quiet Tuesday night at Miller's Diner. Refill coffee, take orders, count tips. But when the masked men stormed in demanding everyone get down, the waitress they'd been ignoring all night became their worst nightmare. Welcome to Hidden Valor Stories. Before we continue this powerful story of courage hidden in plain sight, tell me in the comments from which city you're watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who served in ways the world never knew. The neon sign outside Miller's Diner flickered between open 24 hours and darkness, casting intermittent red shadows across the empty parking lot. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, and the kind of cold that made your breath fog up the windows had settled over the small highway town of Cedar Falls. Sarah Martinez wiped down the same counter for the fourth time that hour, her movements automatic after 3 years of working the graveyard shift. At 65, she moved with a slight limp that most customers attributed to too many years on her feet serving coffee and pie. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her uniform, a faded pink dress with Sarah embroidered on the pocket, had seen better decades. The diner held exactly 7 customers that night. In booth 1, an elderly trucker named Pete nursed his third cup of coffee while studying a road atlas. Booth 3 held Officer Danny Williams, off-duty but still in uniform, pecking at his phone between bites of apple pie. A young couple occupied the corner booth, whispering over shared French fries, and 2 college kids sat at the counter, one studying for what looked like a chemistry exam. The kitchen was manned by Carlos, a 19-year-old kid who'd been working there for 8 months and still burned the eggs half the time. He had earbuds in, nodding to music only he could hear while flipping burgers on the ancient grill. Sarah checked the coffee pots, wiped down the cash register, and surveyed her domain. Miller's Diner wasn't much to look at: cracked vinyl booths, a checkered linoleum floor that had been mopped 1,000 times, and walls decorated with faded photographs of the town's founding fathers. But it was hers during these 8 hours, and she took pride in keeping it running smooth. What none of her customers knew, what nobody in Cedar Falls had ever suspected, was that Sarah Martinez had once been Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, United States Marine Corps, scout sniper, 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, confirmed kills that she'd never spoken about to anyone, not even the VA counselor who'd helped her transition back to civilian life 6 years ago. She'd married young, right out of high school, taking her husband's name before shipping out to Paris Island. When she came back from her final deployment, the marriage hadn't survived what she'd seen and done overseas. The divorce was quiet, amicable even. She'd kept the name Martinez because starting over completely felt like erasing the few good memories she had from those early years. After 2 decades of trying different jobs in different towns, she'd finally found peace in Cedar Falls. The limp came from a roadside bomb outside Ramadi in 2019. Shrapnel had torn through her left leg, ending her military career, but not her life. The doctors said she was lucky. Sarah wasn't sure about that, but she'd learned to carry on. At 11:52 p.m., she started preparing for the midnight rush that never came. Tuesday nights in Cedar Falls were as predictable as sunrise, quiet, uneventful, and exactly the kind of peaceful Sarah had been looking for when she'd moved here 3 years ago. She poured herself a cup of coffee, added 2 sugars, and glanced at the small TV mounted in the corner. The late news was running a story about increased security measures at airports nationwide. Something about credible threats from domestic terror groups. Sarah sipped her coffee and tried not to think about how easy it would be for bad people to cause trouble in a place like Miller's Diner. Wide windows, multiple entrances, no security cameras worth mentioning. It was the kind of soft target that kept former Marines awake at night. But that was paranoid thinking, she told herself. This was Cedar Falls, population 8,400. The biggest crime they'd had in the past year was when teenagers toilet papered the high school principal's house. At 11:57 p.m., a dark SUV with tinted windows pulled into the parking lot and sat idling near the back corner, away from the flickering neon sign. Sarah noticed it immediately. Sarah's training kicked in without her conscious thought. 3 seconds to identify the vehicle: late model Suburban, license plate obscured by mud, engine running. 5 seconds to note the occupants, at least 3 figures visible through the windshield, no movement toward the diner yet. She continued wiping down the counter, but her eyes tracked the SUV and the reflection of the coffee pot. Officer Williams was still absorbed in his phone. The trucker was counting out exact change for his bill. The college kids were debating something about molecular structures. Nobody else had noticed the watchers. Sarah's pulse didn't quicken. That response had been trained out of her years ago in the desert. Instead, her mind shifted into tactical assessment mode. If this was surveillance, they were doing it poorly. Too close to the target, too obvious with the idling engine. If this was reconnaissance for a robbery, they'd picked a diner that rarely had more than $200 in the register. If this was something else... She moved to refill Pete's coffee, positioning herself with a clear line of sight to both the front entrance and the side door that led to the kitchen. The movement was casual, natural. Just a waitress doing her job. "Thanks, darling," Pete said, not looking up from his atlas. "You know how to get from here to Bakersfield without taking the interstate?" "Back roads through Millerville," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "Add about 2 hours to your drive, but it's prettier country." What she didn't say was that she'd memorized every road within a 50-mile radius of Cedar Falls during her first month here. Old habits from a life where knowing your exits could mean the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. The SUV had been sitting there for 4 minutes now, long enough for someone to make a phone call, check a map, or decide whether to proceed with whatever they'd come here to do. Sarah walked back toward the kitchen, ostensibly to check on Carlos, but really to get a better angle on the vehicle. Through the back window, she could see the exhaust vapor rising in the cold air. Still running, still waiting. "Carlos," she said quietly, "what time do you get off tonight?" The kid pulled out one earbud. "Same as always? 7 a.m., why?" "Just checking," she paused. "You got plans for Thanksgiving next week?" It was meaningless conversation, but it served two purposes. It kept her voice calm and normal for any customers who might be listening, and it established that Carlos wasn't expecting to leave early. If something was about to happen, she didn't want him panicking or trying to be a hero. At 12:03 a.m., 2 more vehicles arrived, a white panel van and a dark sedan. They parked at opposite ends of the lot, creating a triangle with the SUV, classic positioning for a coordinated assault. Sarah's mouth went dry, but her hands remained steady as she walked back to the coffee station. She'd seen this setup before, in briefings about insurgent tactics in urban environments. Multiple vehicles, staged positioning, synchronized timing. This wasn't random. This wasn't a robbery. Officer Williams looked up from his phone as she passed his booth. "Sarah? You okay? You look a little pale." For just a moment, she considered telling him. Danny Williams was a good cop, former military himself. Army, if she remembered correctly. But he was also sitting in the booth closest to the front windows, making him the most exposed person in the diner. If she spooked him now, if he went for his weapon or tried to call for backup, it might trigger whatever was about to happen. "Just tired," she said instead. "Long shift." Williams nodded and went back to his phone, but she caught him glancing toward the windows. Maybe he'd noticed something too. The trucker stood up, left a $5 tip, and headed for the door. Sarah wanted to warn him, but she couldn't think of a way to do it without causing alarm. Pete pushed through the front entrance, gave a friendly wave, and walked toward his big rig parked on the far side of the lot. He made it about 20 feet before the men in the SUV moved. 3 men in dark clothing and ski masks emerged from the Suburban with practiced efficiency. The one in the lead carried what looked like an AR-15. The other 2 had handguns drawn. They moved in formation, no shouting, no wasted motion. Pete saw them coming and tried to run. He made it another 10 feet before the man with the rifle put him down with a single shot to the back. The sound echoed across the parking lot like a thunderclap. Inside the diner, everyone froze for exactly 2 seconds. Then chaos erupted. The college girl started screaming. Her boyfriend knocked over his coffee trying to get to his feet. The young couple in the corner booth ducked under their table. Officer Williams was already reaching for his service weapon when the front door exploded inward. "Everybody down, now! Get on the fucking ground!" The man with the AR-15 swept the room with practiced precision, his 2 partners flanking him with handguns raised. They wore tactical vests under their dark jackets and moved like people who'd done this before. Carlos dropped behind the kitchen counter. The college kids hit the floor beside their stools. The young couple stayed hidden under their table, the girl sobbing quietly. Officer Williams had his Glock halfway out of its holster when the second gunman put a bullet through his shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the booth. His weapon clattered to the floor, sliding under a nearby table. "I said, everybody down!" Sarah raised her hands and slowly sank to her knees behind the counter, but her mind was already working the problem. 3 attackers inside, at least 2 more vehicles outside. Unknown additional hostiles, multiple civilian casualties if this went bad. The lead gunman, tall, well-built, moving like someone with military training, posted himself near the front windows where he could watch the parking lot. The other 2 began zip-tying the customers' hands behind their backs, working efficiently and without conversation. "You," the leader pointed at Sarah. "Get over here, now!" She stood slowly, hands visible, and walked toward him. This close, she could see his eyes through the mask. Cold, focused, but not crazy. This wasn't random violence. This was planned. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah?" "Sarah what?" "Martinez." He nodded toward Officer Williams, who was bleeding heavily from his shoulder but still conscious. "Is he the only cop?" Sarah hesitated for exactly the length of time a frightened civilian would hesitate. I think so." "You think so?" The rifle muzzle came up toward her chest. "Are you sure?" Yes, he's the only one." The gunman studied her face, looking for deception. Sarah let her fear show, not the deep tactical assessment her mind was performing, but the surface fear any normal person would feel. Trembling hands, quick breathing, wide eyes. What he couldn't see was that she'd already counted his ammunition. 30-round magazine, probably 1 in the chamber. His partners carried standard capacity pistols, maybe 15 rounds each if they were loaded with extended mags. She'd noted their positioning, their sight lines, their cover options. What he definitely couldn't see was the .38 special revolver taped under the cash register, or the fact that she'd been mentally rehearsing room-clearing procedures for the past 6 years every time she worked alone at night. "Zip tie her hands," the leader ordered one of his men. As the plastic restraint tightened around her wrists, Sarah felt a familiar calm settling over her. It was the same feeling she'd had on Overwatch in Fallujah, waiting for the target to appear in her scope. Time seemed to slow down. Her hearing became hyper-acute. Her peripheral vision expanded. She was no longer Sarah Martinez, the tired waitress with the slight limp. She was Staff Sergeant Chen, and she was back in the war. The zip tie around Sarah's wrists was tight, but not professionally done. The man who'd secured her had left about an inch of slack, enough for someone who knew how to dislocate their own thumb to slip free. It would hurt like hell, but Sarah had endured worse. She was forced to kneel with the other hostages in the center of the dining area while the 3 gunmen took positions around the room. The leader remained by the front windows, his rifle trained on the parking lot. The second man, shorter and stockier, moved to the back door leading to the kitchen. The third positioned himself where he could cover both the hostages and the side entrance. Officer Williams was bleeding steadily from his shoulder wound, but trying to stay alert. The college kids were crying quietly. The young couple held each other under the table, whispering what might have been prayers. Carlos was still hidden behind the kitchen counter, and as far as Sarah could tell, the gunman hadn't spotted him yet. "Phoenix 1, this is Phoenix 2, the leader spoke into a radio clipped to his vest. "Package is secure. 3 minutes to set up." The response crackled back. "Copy, Phoenix 2. Overwatch confirms no additional law enforcement. You're clear for Phase 2. Sarah's blood ran cold. Overwatch meant snipers, probably positioned on the hills overlooking the diner. A coordinated team with professional equipment and military-style communications. This wasn't terrorism in the traditional sense. This was something more specific. The stocky gunman pulled out what looked like a small video camera and began setting it up on one of the tables, aiming it toward the hostages. They were going to record whatever came next. "Listen carefully," the leader announced, his voice carrying easily through the small diner. "We are soldiers of the American Liberation Front. For too long, this country has been controlled by corrupt politicians and foreign influences. Tonight, we take the first step toward reclaiming our homeland." Sarah recognized the rhetoric from FBI briefings she'd attended during her final year in the Marines. Domestic terrorist groups had been proliferating since 2020, many of them led by military veterans who felt betrayed by the government they'd served. "The message we send tonight will be seen around the world," he continued. "Your sacrifice will not be forgotten." The college girl started sobbing harder. "Please, we didn't do anything. We're just students." "You're symbols," the leader replied coldly. "Symbols of a society that has forgotten what America is supposed to be." The camera was recording now, its red light blinking steadily. Sarah forced herself to look afraid and helpless while her tactical mind continued working the problem. 3 shooters inside. Unknown number outside providing overwatch and security, professional equipment, and coordination. This was going to be a massacre designed for maximum media impact, probably timed to coincide with some political event or anniversary. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the Waitress. Sarah began testing the zip tie, applying gentle pressure to gauge its strength and flexibility. The pain in her thumb joint was already building, but she knew from experience that she could pop it out of socket if necessary. She also began cataloging everything she could use as a weapon. The coffee pot on the burner was nearly full and hot enough to cause serious burns. The cash register drawer, if opened hard enough, could catch someone in the ribs. The industrial salt and pepper shakers were heavy enough to do damage if thrown accurately. Most importantly, there was the .38 special under the register. 5 rounds of .158 grain lead, loaded for reliability rather than stopping power. It wouldn't put down a determined attacker immediately, but placed correctly, it would end the threat. The problem was getting to it. "Phoenix 2, this is Phoenix 1, the radio crackled. "Local law enforcement response time is approximately 12 minutes. State police are 23 minutes out. You have a narrow window." 12 minutes. That was both an eternity and no time at all. The leader checked his watch and nodded to his partners. "Begin Phase 3. The stocky gunman moved toward Officer Williams, zip ties in one hand, combat knife in the other. His intention was clear. They were going to start with the cop, make an example, show their audience that no one was safe. Sarah watched him approach, her mind calculating distances and angles. Danny Williams was tough, but he was losing blood fast and wouldn't be able to help even if he wanted to. The other hostages were paralyzed with fear. Carlos was still hidden in the kitchen, but he was just a kid with no combat training. It was going to have to be her. "You know what your problem is?" Sarah said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. All 3 gunmen turned toward her. The leader's rifle swung in her direction. "Did someone give you permission to speak?" he demanded. Sarah looked directly at him, and for just a moment let a hint of the warrior show through. "Your problem is that you think you're soldiers, but you're not." The room went absolutely still. "Excuse me?" The leader's voice was deadly quiet. Sarah continued, her tone conversational, almost bored. "Real soldiers don't shoot unarmed truck drivers in the back. Real soldiers don't terrorize college kids and waitresses. You want to know what real soldiers do?" She could see the anger building behind his eyes, exactly what she was counting on. Angry people made mistakes. They protect people who can't protect themselves. The leader took 3 quick steps toward her, the rifle barrel stopping inches from her face. "You think you know about soldiers, Waitress? You think you know what we've sacrificed?" "I know you've forgotten what the uniform means," Sarah replied calmly. "I know you've dishonored every real warrior who ever wore it." The slap came hard and fast, snapping her head to the side. She felt blood in her mouth but didn't react otherwise. "You want to see what soldiers do?" the leader snarled. "Maybe we'll start with you instead of the cop." Perfect. He grabbed her by the shoulder and hauled her to her feet, dragging her toward the front of the diner where the camera would get a better angle. In the process, he pulled her past the cash register. Sarah waited until his attention was fully focused on positioning her for the recording, then made her move. The dislocated thumb technique was something she'd learned in advanced escape and evasion training. It was excruciating, but effective. She jerked her hand at precisely the right angle, felt the joint separate with a wet pop, and her left hand slipped free of the zip tie. The leader was still adjusting the camera angle when she drove her elbow backward into his solar plexus with everything she had. He doubled over, gasping, and Sarah spun around him, her right hand, still zip-tied, swinging up to grab the rifle barrel while her left hand dove under the cash register. Her fingers found the grip of the .38 just as the second gunman realized what was happening. Time fractured into milliseconds. Sarah's left hand came up with the revolver just as the stocky gunman's pistol swung toward her. She fired twice, center mass, the .38's report deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. The gunman went down hard, his weapon clattering across the linoleum. The leader was still fighting for breath, trying to bring his rifle to bear, but Sarah had control of the barrel. She twisted it upward and fired her third round into his chest from point-blank range. He dropped like a stone. The third gunman, positioned by the side entrance, had a clear shot at her, but Sarah was already moving. She rolled behind the counter as his first bullet shattered the coffee pot where she'd been standing. "Carlos!" she shouted toward the kitchen. "Stay down and don't move!" The gunman fired twice more, both rounds punching through the thin wooden counter, but Sarah was already on the move, crawling toward the end where the counter met the wall. She had 2 rounds left, one enemy inside, unknown number outside. The radio on the dead leader's vest crackled. "Phoenix 2, report." "We heard gunshots." The surviving gunman looked toward the radio, and Sarah took the opportunity to peer around the end of the counter. He was positioned about 15 feet away, his back partially to the windows, weapon trained on where he thought she was hiding. Military training, but not elite. He was focused on his immediate threat and had forgotten about situational awareness. Sarah rose slightly and put her 4th bullet through the base of his skull. The diner fell silent, except for the ringing in everyone's ears and the quiet sobbing of the college girl. Sarah remained crouched behind the counter, the .38 trained on the front windows, her mind automatically shifting into post-engagement assessment mode. 3 tangos down inside. Radio chatter indicated overwatch positions outside. Local law enforcement 12 minutes out when the shooting started, so maybe 8 minutes now. She had 1 round left and unknown enemies with sniper rifles who could pin her down until reinforcements arrived. The radio crackled again. Phoenix 2, respond immediately. Then, "Phoenix 1, we've lost contact with the assault team. Initiating contingency plan." Sarah's blood ran cold. Contingency plan usually meant either extraction or elimination of witnesses. She looked around the diner. Officer Williams was conscious but in no condition to fight. The hostages were all still zip-tied and in shock. Carlos was hiding in the kitchen. If the outside team came in shooting, everyone in here would die. Sarah made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation she'd developed over 6 years of civilian life. She was going to have to go outside. "Danny," she called to Officer Williams, "can you hear me?" The wounded cop raised his head slightly. "Sarah? What the hell? How did you—" "Listen to me carefully," she said, keeping her voice calm and authoritative. "There are more of them outside. I need you to get everyone into the kitchen and barricade the door. Can you do that?" Williams struggled to sit up. "I can try, but do it now. Get Carlos to help you move the hostages." Sarah ejected the empty brass from the .38 and looked around for additional ammunition. The dead terrorists would have spare magazines for their weapons, but she'd need time to figure out how to use them effectively. Instead, she made her way to the leader's body and carefully lifted his rifle. A R-15 platform, familiar enough from her military training. She checked the magazine, still had about 20 rounds, and quickly examined the weapon for any modifications or unusual features. Standard military-style setup. She could work with this. The radio chattered again. "Phoenix 3 and 4, close on the target building. Phoenix 5, maintain overwatch on the highway approaches." At least 2 more coming in, 1 sniper remaining in position. Sarah looked out the front windows and immediately spotted muzzle flashes from the hillside about 300 meters away. The overwatch sniper was firing at something, probably Officer Williams's patrol car, trying to disable any communications equipment. She also saw 2 figures moving across the parking lot, using the abandoned vehicles for cover. They were advancing methodically, professionally, but they were making the same mistake their teammates had made. They were underestimating the opposition. Sarah checked the rifle's optics. Basic red dot sight, easy enough to use. She moved to the side window where she'd have a better angle on the approaching hostiles while staying out of the sniper's line of sight. The first man came around the back of Pete's truck, moving low and fast toward the diner's side entrance. Sarah put the red dot on his chest and squeezed the trigger. He went down immediately, his partner diving for cover behind the white panel van. The radio exploded with chatter. "Contact! Contact! Phoenix 3 is down! Phoenix 5, do you have eyes on the shooter?" "Negative. Muzzle flash came from inside the target building." Sarah smiled grimly. They were rattled now, and rattled people made mistakes. She moved to a different window, using the same tactics she'd employed in urban combat overseas. Never fire from the same position twice. Always assume the enemy is adjusting their response based on your last known location. The second man was trapped behind the panel van with limited options. He could try to reach the diner's back entrance through the kitchen, but that would mean crossing open ground. He could wait for backup, but local law enforcement would arrive soon. Or he could try to flank around the building and come in through the front. Sarah positioned herself where she could cover both the front entrance and the side windows, the rifle's barrel resting on a table for stability. She didn't have to wait long. The man came around the van in a combat role, firing as he moved, trying to lay down suppressive fire while he reached better cover. Sarah tracked him smoothly, the way she'd tracked insurgents in Fallujah, and put 2 rounds center mass. He didn't get up. The hillside sniper was now in a difficult position. His assault team was dead, local law enforcement would arrive within minutes, and he was facing an unknown shooter inside the diner who had just demonstrated considerable skill and tactical awareness. Sarah could see him through the rifle's optic, a dark figure prone behind a rocky outcropping about 300 meters away. Too far for an accurate shot with an AR-15, but close enough that he could put rounds through the diner's windows if he chose to. The radio had gone quiet. Sarah moved away from the windows and made her way toward the kitchen, where she found Carlos helping Officer Williams cut the zip ties off the hostages with a knife from the prep area. "Is everyone okay?" she asked. The college kids were shaken but unhurt. The young couple was in shock but functioning. Officer Williams was pale from blood loss but alert. "Sarah," he said quietly, "where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" She ignored the question. "How long until backup arrives?" "Should be any minute now," Williams replied. "But there's still one of them out there, right?" Sarah nodded. "Sniper on the hillside. He's got us pinned down, but he's also trapped. If he tries to leave, he'll have to cross open ground, and I can see his position from here." She was thinking like a Marine again, evaluating tactical situations and considering all possible outcomes. The sniper's best move would be to withdraw before law enforcement arrived, but that would mean abandoning his mission and probably facing consequences from whatever organization had planned this attack. His worst move would be to try to complete the mission by eliminating witnesses, which would mean shooting through the diner's windows indiscriminately. His most likely move. The radio crackled one more time. "All Phoenix units, this is Phoenix 1. Mission is compromised. Execute Protocol 7 and extract immediately." Sarah's stomach dropped. Protocol 7 was military slang for eliminate all witnesses and evidence. The sniper was going to try to burn down the diner with everyone inside. Sarah saw the muzzle flash from the hillside at the same moment she heard the distinctive whistle of an incoming round. The bullet punched through the front window and buried itself in the back wall, exactly where someone standing behind the counter would have been. He was ranging his shots, adjusting for wind and distance. The second round came through the side window, shattering glass and sending fragments across the dining area. "Everyone stay in the kitchen," Sarah shouted. "Get as far back as possible." But she knew the kitchen wouldn't provide much protection if the sniper had armor-piercing rounds. The diner's walls were just wood frame and drywall, no more resistant to rifle bullets than tissue paper. She had to end this now, before he found his range. Sarah grabbed the dead leader's radio and keyed the microphone. "Phoenix 1, this is Phoenix 2. The response came immediately. "Phoenix 2, report status." Sarah disguised her voice, making it deeper, more masculine. "Targets are secured. Ready for extraction." A pause. "Phoenix 2, you don't sound right. Authenticate with today's code word." Damn. She'd hoped to fool him long enough to get him to expose his position, but professional units always had authentication protocols. The next bullet came through a different window, and Sarah realized he was working a pattern, systematically covering every angle where someone might be taking cover. She looked at the AR-15 in her hands. 20 rounds left, maybe. The range was extreme for this weapon, but not impossible if she could get to a stable shooting position with good visibility. The problem was that any position good enough for her to take the shot would also expose her to his fire. Sarah made a decision that would have horrified her commanding officers back in Iraq. She was going to take the shot anyway. She moved to the front door, staying low, and carefully pushed it open. The sniper's next round came within inches of her head, but she'd already spotted his muzzle flash and was calculating the adjustment needed. 300 meters, uphill, light crosswind from the west, target behind cover but partially exposed. Sarah took a deep breath, let half of it out, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck sparks off the rocks near the sniper's position, close enough to make him flinch, but not close enough to hit. His return shot shattered the doorframe beside her head. Sarah adjusted her aim slightly and fired again. This time she saw the sniper jerk backward, but he wasn't down. Wounded maybe, but still functional. She had 18 rounds left. The next exchange happened fast. Sarah fired 3 rounds in quick succession, forcing the sniper to take cover, while he responded with 2 shots that came uncomfortably close to her position. Then she heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens. Multiple vehicles, approaching fast from the direction of town. The sniper heard them too. Sarah saw him through the rifle scope, trying to disengage from his position, probably hoping to reach an extraction point before law enforcement could surround the area. She put her crosshairs on his center mass and fired one more time. The figure on the hillside went still. The first police car arrived at 12:27 a.m., followed immediately by 2 more units and an ambulance. The officers who entered the diner found a scene that would be talked about in law enforcement circles for years to come. 4 dead terrorists, 7 alive hostages, and 1 waitress sitting calmly at the counter, an AR-15 rifle broken down into its component parts on the table in front of her. Officer Williams had managed to give the arriving officers a brief radio update, so they weren't walking in completely blind, but the full scope of what had happened took hours to piece together. Sarah Martinez, whose real military record was unsealed by FBI investigators the following morning, had single-handedly eliminated a 5-person domestic terrorist cell that had been planning to broadcast the massacre of innocent civilians as part of a larger campaign of political violence. The investigation revealed that the American Liberation Front was a well-funded organization with cells in 6 states, and the Cedar Falls attack was intended to be the opening move in a coordinated series of attacks designed to destabilize local governments and provoke martial law. Instead, it became a case study in why professional terrorists should never underestimate quiet people with hidden skills. Sarah spent 3 days answering questions from FBI agents, ATF investigators, and military intelligence officers who wanted to understand exactly how a waitress with a slight limp had managed to outfight a team of trained killers. The answer, they discovered, was simple. She hadn't been a waitress that night. She'd been a Marine. Sarah Martinez returned to work at Miller's Diner exactly 1 week after the attack. The windows had been replaced, the bullet holes patched, and the bloodstains cleaned from the floor. But everyone who walked through the front door could feel that something fundamental had changed. The story had made national news, of course. Waitress defeats terror cell was the headline in most papers, though Sarah had refused all interview requests. The details that emerged painted a picture of extraordinary heroism under impossible circumstances. But Sarah herself remained as quiet and unassuming as ever. She still worked the graveyard shift. She still limped slightly when she walked. She still served coffee with a smile and remembered how customers liked their eggs. But now, when she moved through the diner, there was something different in her bearing. The other employees spoke to her with a kind of reverence. Customers who'd heard the story watched her with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The local police officers who stopped by for coffee never let her pay for her own meals. Officer Williams, recovering from his shoulder wound, stopped by on his first day back to work. "Sarah," he said, settling into his usual booth, "can I ask you something?" She poured his coffee, added the cream he preferred, and waited. "How long have you been carrying that weight?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question for a long moment. The weight of what she'd done overseas, the weight of the lives she'd taken and the ones she'd saved, the weight of coming home to a country that didn't understand what war really meant. "Long enough," she said finally. Williams nodded. He understood in the way that only another veteran could understand. "Well," he said, "for what it's worth, I'm glad you were carrying it that night." Sarah smiled, a real smile, not the polite customer service smile she usually wore. "Me too," she said. At 2 a.m. that night, as she wiped down the same counter she'd taken cover behind during the firefight, Sarah reflected on how strange life could be. For 3 years, she'd been running from her past, trying to become someone ordinary and unremarkable. In the end, it was that past that had saved the lives of everyone she'd come to care about. She finished cleaning, checked the coffee pots, and surveyed her domain. Miller's Diner wasn't much to look at, but it was hers during these 8 hours, and she took pride in keeping it safe. For 23 years, Sarah had been trying to find her place in a world that didn't quite know what to do with old warriors. She'd worked in factories, offices, retail stores, always competent, always reliable, but never quite fitting in. Cedar Falls was different. Here, she'd finally found peace in the simple rhythm of night shifts and regular customers. Now, as she looked around the rebuilt diner, Sarah realized something had changed that night, not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. For the first time since leaving the Marines, she felt complete. She wasn't hiding from her past anymore. She was honoring it. A new customer walked through the front door, a young man in his 20s, nervous energy, checking his phone constantly. Sarah watched him from behind the counter, old instincts automatically cataloging details. But this time, she didn't see a potential threat. She saw someone who might need a cup of coffee and a kind word. "Evening, hun," she called out. "Coffee to start?" The young man looked up, surprised by the warmth in her voice. "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you." As Sarah poured his coffee, she noticed the small American flag pin on his jacket lapel. Military family, probably. Maybe a veteran himself, though he looked too young for the recent conflicts. "You traveling through?" she asked, setting down the cup. "Yes, ma'am. Driving to Fort Bragg. I ship out next week." Sarah smiled, a real smile, the kind she'd been giving more often lately. "First deployment?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm nervous as hell, if I'm being honest." Sarah leaned against the counter, studying the young soldier's face. She saw herself at that age, eager, scared, determined, and completely unprepared for what war would teach her. "What's your name, son?" "Jackson, ma'am. Private First Class Michael Jackson." He gave a sheepish grin. "And yes, I get the jokes about the name." "Well, Private Jackson," Sarah said, refilling his cup without being asked, "let me tell you something. Being nervous means you're smart enough to understand that what you're about to do matters. The ones who weren't nervous were usually the ones who didn't make it home." Jackson looked at her with new interest. "Were you military, ma'am?" Sarah considered the question. 3 weeks ago, she would have deflected it, changed the subject, found some excuse to walk away. Tonight, she met his eyes directly. "Marines," she said simply. "Long time ago." "What was it like?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to answer that question honestly without scaring a kid who was about to face his own test. "Hard," she said finally. "Harder than anything you can imagine. But also," she paused, looking for the right words, "it teaches you things about yourself that you can't learn any other way. Good things and difficult things. You'll carry both for the rest of your life." Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah looked around the diner, at the patched bullet holes that were barely visible unless you knew where to look, at the coffee pot that had been replaced after being shattered by gunfire, at the quiet customers who trusted her to keep them safe during their vulnerable moments. "No," she said. "I don't regret it. What I learned over there, it's part of who I am, and sometimes when it really matters, that knowledge serves a purpose." The young soldier seemed to understand that there was more to her story, but he was wise enough not to push for details. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, "for the coffee and the advice. You take care of yourself over there, Private Jackson, and remember, your job isn't to be a hero. Your job is to come home safe so you can be whatever you're meant to be next." Jackson left a $10 tip on a $3 cup of coffee and headed for the door. As he reached it, he turned back. "Ma'am? Thank you for your service." Sarah nodded once, accepting the recognition she'd never asked for but had finally learned she deserved. After he left, she returned to her routine, cleaning tables, refilling coffee pots, keeping watch over her small corner of the world. But something felt different now. For 23 years, she'd carried her service like a burden, something heavy and painful that she couldn't put down but couldn't share either. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like an honor. At 3 a.m., Officer Williams stopped by for his usual check-in. His shoulder was still stiff from the gunshot wound, but he was back to full duty. "Quiet night?" he asked, settling into his regular booth. "The best kind," Sarah replied, pouring his coffee without being asked. "Sarah," Williams said after a moment, "can I ask you something personal?" She waited, knowing what was coming. "Do you miss it?" "The military life, I mean." Sarah considered the question while she wiped down the counter. "I miss the clarity," she said eventually. "In war, you always know who the good guys are and what needs to be done. Out here, it's more complicated. But you're still doing the job," Williams observed, "just in a different uniform." Sarah looked down at her pink waitress dress and laughed. "I suppose I am." "For what it's worth," Williams said, "I'm glad you're here. This place feels safer with you behind that counter." "It is safer," Sarah replied simply. As dawn approached, Sarah began the closing routine she'd performed hundreds of times before. But now she moved with a different kind of purpose. She wasn't just cleaning up after the night shift, she was preparing her post for the next watch, making sure everything was ready for whoever would need sanctuary in the hours to come. Outside, a police car made its regular patrol through the parking lot. Inside, Sarah Martinez finished her last cup of coffee of the night and prepared to head home to a few hours of sleep before returning for another shift. She was 65 years old, had been in more firefights than most soldiers, and could still disassemble an AR-15 in under 30 seconds if necessary. But mostly, she was just Sarah, the night shift waitress who remembered how you liked your eggs and always had a kind word for travelers passing through. Some heroes wear dress blues and medals. Others wear pink uniforms and sensible shoes. The best ones never tell you which they prefer. The end. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Sarah Martinez? A grandmother, a veteran, someone who seemed ordinary on the surface but carried the quiet strength of a warrior? Someone who never asked for recognition but earned your respect through their actions when it mattered most? Share their story in the comments. Tell us how they inspired you, because here at Hidden Valor Stories, we believe the most powerful heroes are often the ones serving coffee at 2 a.m., watching over us when we're too tired to watch over ourselves. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you about a 65-year-old warrior who found peace in service of a different kind, subscribe and help us honor the silent guardians who walk among us every day. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, remember, never underestimate the waitress, especially if she's been places you can't imagine.